Good morning. A special welcome to the hundreds of students and faculty in the audience this morning. We will be exploring the function of anger as both a tool and reactionary response within the political realm. The anger of citizens is reflected in the tone and rhetoric of our presidential candidates. Anger resonates from both sides of the political spectrum. It comes up when candidates discuss the unjust policing of communities of color, how best to manage immigration reform both locally and globally, and how to adequately address economic inequalities. Do we close corporate tax loopholes, implement a simplified tax structure, or raise taxes on the 1%? In our current political climate, anger serves as a spectacle, one that can work to highlight social justice causes, give voice to frustrated demographics, or attempt to quell political justice and action. Our distinguished speakers today will interrogate this spectacle of anger, its role in social justice organizing, how it is taken up in social media, how anger tracks and is informed by racial and economic inequalities, and how this anger has reverberated around the globe. We invite you to reflect and engage with these ideas and how we can channel anger to be a transformative tool. As students, citizens, community leaders, and within this institution of higher education, we should seek to transform anger and temper it with education. This conference is a collective effort led by the Associate Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, Wartina Davis, and the Multidisciplinary Conference committee members, Fanny Lauby from Political Science, Chris Hawley, Psychology, Marquita Smith, English, Thomas Owosu, Geography and Urban Studies, Judith Broom, English, Megan Devlin from the Dean's Office, and myself, Liz Victor, from the Department of Philosophy. This event is co-sponsored by the Office of Sophomore and Junior Experience, Africana World Studies, Anthropology, Asian Studies, English, Geography and Urban Studies, History, Languages and Cultures, Latin American and Latino Studies, Liberal Studies, Philosophy, Political Science, Psychology, Sociology, Women's and Gender Studies, graduate programs in Applied Sociology, English, History, Psychology, and Public Policy and International Affairs, the Center for Teaching Excellence, Office of Employment Equity and Diversity, and the Social Justice Project. This has been and is a multidisciplinary effort. A special thanks to the technicians and staff in the Instruction and Research Technology Department, especially Greg Madison, Roderick Holliday, and Patrick Ryan, the staff at Hospitality Services for the room preparation and catering throughout the day, the team members in the Office of the Dean for all their hard work in bringing the conference to fruition, and of course, all of you here today. It is my pleasure to recognize Tom Gunling, Assistant to the Dean, and to introduce the Dean of the Humanities and Social Sciences, Cara Rabbit, to give the welcome address. Thank you.
Thank you. It is my pleasure and my privilege to welcome you on behalf of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences to our 5th annual multidisciplinary conference. Dr. Victor mentioned the members of the committee, but I want to take another moment to recognize their efforts. This event comes together every year based on their imaginings, organization, and hard work. They've been meeting since last fall to make this a reality and been meeting weekly leading up to this. So I would like to just take a moment to formally thank the members of the committee. They're at the back of the room. co-chairs, Dr. Victor and Dr. Fanny Loby from political science, Judith Broom and Marquita Smith from English, Chris Holly, who's on the podium as one of the moderators today, from psychology. Switched there for a moment. Thomas Owusu from Geography and Urban Studies, and as Dr. Victor mentioned, Megan Devlin from the Dean's Office, and our extraordinary Associate Dean, Wartina Davis. Please join me in thanking the committee. This annual conference we launched 5 years ago as part of our college strategic plan. It provides a unique opportunity for faculty-led collaboration across the humanities and social sciences and with other university offices to investigate timely and important issues. In previous years, we have explored such topics as social inequality and elections, access to and political pressures on higher education in America, the cognitive and social impact of our digital age, and how we understand and confront difference. We have brought in experts in public policy, social psychology, criminal justice, digital humanities, media studies, and other theoretical and applied areas of our disciplines to help us engage these questions with students, with our colleagues, and with community members. These dialogues really speak, and this is why it is such a key effort of the college as part of our strategic plan, they really speak to the core elements of our vision, of our collective purpose. The mission statement of the College of Humanities and Social Science states that we are dedicated to the primacy of liberal arts in higher education and to the advancement of knowledge. And when there's students in the room, I always want to stress that liberal arts, which include the arts and sciences and humanities and social and behavioral sciences, we feel are the core of a university education. They give you the breadth and the understanding and the context for your professional choices. Our programs are specifically designed to, and I quote, provide insight into the past, critically examine contemporary issues, and explore answers for the future while promoting diversity. And we take these steps because we know that the study that we do in our disciplines will prepare students with the research, analytical, and communication skills they will need for their professional lives, for advanced study, and for responsible citizenship. So today's topic particularly makes evident how important these dialogues are, these opportunities to reflect and to learn from each other, from outside speakers, across various perspectives. Learning how to respond thoughtfully rather than viscerally, to research and fact check rather than take statements at face value, to understand the import of the decisions we face in the voting booth. These are keys to responsible citizenship. The primary responsibility of higher education is not to teach students what to think, but rather to teach them how to think critically and with depth. Today, we examine the transformative power of those strategies. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning. Let's try again. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. So I know that some of you might be channeling your inner Marshawn Lynch and thinking, I'm just here so I won't get fined by my professor. That only works if you have a multi-million-dollar contract, and Lynch is no longer really playing. So indulge me for the few moments that we're here. I want to also thank the organizing committee for putting this together. It's a lot of hard work, but for also showing us that the work we do as academics can have practical relevance. I'm Kalila Brown Dean. I'm an associate professor of political science at Quinnipiac University in Connecticut. And I'll say that of the many roles that I play in life, The one that I cherish the most is being a mother. So I'm a mom to a bright 8-year-old girl who challenges me on just about everything. And on Fridays, I tape a TV show, so she comes with me and she listens to me have these debates about politics. And the one thing that I've really learned from her during this political season is that we have to reject political correctness, but always demand civility. And so when she was younger, my husband and I would always try to teach her not to be angry. So we didn't want her to be angry that Swiper kept messing up Dora's adventure. We would tell her, no, don't be angry that the teenage neighbors are challenging you in Pokemon Go. Anyone remember that game, right? Because we didn't think that anger was a good emotion. We thought it was a negative feeling, and we really worked hard to encourage her not to feel that. And I think that collectively, that is much of our thinking. We believe that anger is a negative, destructive emotion that leads to poor decisions and poor behaviors. But what I've also learned over the last 8 years is that that's really doing a disservice, not just in our parenting, but in our politics. So we have to understand that anger is often connected to other emotions, things like shame, like hurt, like frustration. And so if we look at that in our political space, we can understand that sometimes it's legitimate to feel angry about your current situation or about how you feel that your life factors into broader American society. And let's face it, sometimes when you see your favorite team, Cleveland Cavaliers, blow a 20-point lead, you feel angry, and that's okay too. So that's the sentiment that I want to guide my remarks today. The ways in which this sense of anger and frustration is fueling political movements and how that anger can be channeled into positive political change. So I'll tell you, I'm getting over bronchitis, so it's why the voice is a little shaky, but we're gonna get through it together. So the second key point that I want to keep in mind is that we live in a time in our country where Black death has become public spectacle. So I can tell you that I will never watch the video of Laquan McDonald being killed in Chicago. I cannot watch the video of Philando Castile being killed in Minnesota. Because too often what we do is we watch that spectacle, we hold on to that anger, and we never figure out what we do with it. So what I'm interested in are the ways in which communities, individuals, and organizations are really working to move those things forward. So let me take you back to 2015. Last year, my family and I traveled to Selma, Alabama for the 50th anniversary of the Bloody Sunday March in Selma. So we were there. I had written this report about voting rights in the United States, where we have come since 1965 and what we need to do moving forward. This will be the first presidential election in 50 years where the protections of the Voting Rights Act do not apply. And so we were there in Selma. It's very hot. It's 90 degrees. We're standing outside. And we have 2 young kids with us. My colleague is there. We have our children. So we're out in a hot Alabama sun waiting for the president's address, which meant we were there for 4 hours. So imagine 2 7-year-old kids out in the sun for 4 hours. The fact that they didn't revolt, I thought, was a victory. So while we're there, my daughter notices this older gentleman standing beside us, and when he moves, she notices that there are scars on his arm. So her being inquisitive says, "Sir, what's wrong with your arm?" And I kind of cringe, like, "No, you don't ask. Just look, don't ask." And he said, "No, it's fine." So he told her that those scars were from when he marched in 1965 as a high school student in Selma. Those scars were because he had been attacked by a dog, right? So an officer's dog had viciously attacked him and left him with these permanent scars. And so as President Obama took the stage, as former President George W. Bush took his seat, this man began to weep uncontrollably. So this is the gentleman that you see holding his hand high there. So our kids ask him, "Sir, what's wrong? Why are you crying?" And he said, "I'm crying because this is a moment I never thought possible." So here's a man who has served our country as a veteran, who has served our country honorably, and was run out of his hometown because he believed in America's promise. So it was there on that bridge, right? So the bridge in Selma is soaked in the blood of martyrs who gave their lives because they wanted our country to be greater, because they believed in that dream. So hearing his discussion of what it meant for him, and understanding that it wasn't about a candidate, it wasn't about a party, had us leaving Selma feeling really hopeful. So I was able to put aside my typical academic cynicism and think, oh, look, this is great, this is progress. So a lot of what we know in political science is that, in fact, communities of color have made tremendous progress in the political space. We now have African Americans and Latinos voting in higher numbers than ever before. We've seen some increases in office holding as well. So candidates of color have been mayors of cities as diverse as Newark and Denver. We've had 9 elected minority governors, seated our first Latina Supreme Court justice, and an African-American family now resides in the White House. So I left thinking, this is great. This is evidence of what can happen from a painful moment to then move toward political power. And then about a week after returning from Selma, my cell phone started erupting. So I'm a self-professed old lady. My phone goes off at 9 o'clock. I'm in the bed by 9:30. If the phone rings past 9:30, it better be an emergency. So at 11 o'clock this particular night, my phone starts erupting, and I think maybe I should check this because something bad must have happened. And when I opened my phone, this is the image that I saw from my alma mater, the University of Virginia. So I want you to hold this young man's name in your thinking. His name is Martise Johnson. Martise was an honor student at the University of Virginia who grew up on the south side of Chicago to a single mother raising 3 boys, who kept thinking, if I could just get him out of Chicago, he'll be okay. If I could just get him to college, all of the challenges that he faces here in our neighborhood will go away. And so that night, Martise was out with a group of friends, fellow college students, when an alcohol enforcement agent rushed him to the ground, accusing him of trying to present a fake ID. So the bar owner came out and said, no, it's not that guy. He never tried to get into our bar. He never had a fake ID. The officers continued to battle Martise, and so that's his bloody face. So a student who was there took the picture and sent it to us as a group of alumni to say, we need your help. So we listened to the video from that night, and you can hear Martise screaming and pleading, but I go to UVA, but I go to UVA. So that wasn't a cry of entitlement. It was a desperate plea for humanity. And so you see the further pictures of Martise shackled to the back of an ambulance. So even with his head bloodied from that gash, they would not render service until he could be fully shackled and held as well. So the next day, a student called and said, what are you going to do about this? And I turned the question to say, what are we going to do? So we were angry, but we were also hurt. And we realized that the pain that we were feeling, that here was this young man who had done everything that we tell young people to do. So he didn't end up on the ground because his pants were sagging or because he didn't use the King's English. What we realized in that moment of Martise and why we felt so angry is because we realized that degrees don't protect us and that titles won't shield us. So what did we do? We did what we've seen social justice organizers do across the country over the last 2 years. We used the current tools of technology to not only link people together, but to come up with a plan of action. So within hours, a change.org petition generated over 300,000 signatures of people demanding an independent investigation. Through crowdfunding, we were able to raise $75,000 in 2 days to get Martise's mother from Chicago to Virginia. Martise's mother lost her job because her employer told us, you can go to Virginia and check on your son, but there won't be a job here for you when you return. Using those tools of technology to do what activists and organizers have done for decades. So this is a picture of Martise in the middle. We organized a group of alumni to come back. So over 400 alumni came back on this weekend to march to the university president's home with a list of demands. And so as you'll remember this in terms of how the president's house is at the top of the hill, we're marching up the hill with Martise, that's him in the middle, and his whole body starts to tense up. So I lean over and I say, what's wrong? What's going on? He sees an officer's car coming down the hill, and he just froze, right? So we lean over to him and say, don't worry, we got you. That officer was there to protect us, because while we were organizing to demand justice for Martise and really for all students, there were counter-protesters there. So that anger that we felt to fuel into that positive action, to march and to protest, is also the anger that other people felt that we were making illegitimate demands. So we teach young people to respect law enforcement and to go to them when they need help, and we should do that. But we also have to push back against those who see Black or see brown and think criminal. So what we learned through this organizing process is that for many people, if has become their favorite word, right? If Sandra Bland had just put out the cigarette sooner, if Eric Garner had just gotten onto the sidewalk, if Tamir Rice hadn't been playing in the park, none of this would be necessary. And so we learned through this experience that if is the enemy of progress when we think about positive social change. And we also have to recognize our sort of collective hypocrisy. When we look at places like Ferguson and Baltimore and ask, why would people destroy their own neighborhoods? I really supported those people in Baltimore until they burned down the CVS. There is no political meaning in what they do. So when we condemn those kinds of uprisings, of how people channel their anger, but then we dismiss overzealous college sports fans as just sort of youthful indiscretion, then we never fully grasp how anger works in this process. We also don't understand the anger and frustration that people feel when in certain cases victims become defendants. So it's no longer about what someone did to harm you, but about what you did to put yourself into that situation. So how we cover Dylan Roof, who murdered parishioners in South Carolina, is very different from how we talk about Trayvon Martin, right? Trayvon Martin had been suspended 3 times from school, had had marijuana at some point in his life. Therefore, there must have been a cause for that. So we then start to see that anger as illegitimate. And a lot of what I do in terms of the work is how the concentration of punishment in particular communities leads to these outcomes. So that when we concentrate incarceration, punishment, and disenfranchisement in particular communities, it becomes a breeding ground for anger, frustration, and tension. Not just about how communities feel about law enforcement, but about how communities feel about themselves. And when you're in a constant position as a law enforcement officer or as a community member of feeling like you have to defend your existence, then it moves us away from our goal. Right? So a lot of what people have asked me over the last year is why? Why now? So why do people get so upset when an unarmed person is killed by a law enforcement officer? Why don't we feel that same anger and frustration when we witness Black people killing other Black people, or when we witness Latinos taking the lives of other people of color, right? Why don't we hear that same frustration? And so my response is always the same. Just because we choose not to listen does not mean that those voices are not being raised. There's a long historical tension within communities related to how we approach law and order and which communities we believe need this additional law enforcement. So I'm really into politics, but sports and music is probably more of my passion. And this picture is from Watts, right? A very famous Watts riot where 34 people lost their lives. And it was started by an allegation of police brutality and police misconduct. If you know music, this has also become the album cover for The Roots and their album, Things Fall Apart, right? So the past is always prologue in American politics. The tools that people use for social justice organizing may be new and may be different, but those long-standing tensions are the same. And so part of, how am I on time? Good. So part of what we look at as well in terms of this contemporary anger and how people are channeling that in social justice movements is a realization that these efforts don't occur in a vacuum. So Ferguson doesn't happen overnight. It's not that there's one instance that then makes people respond in these particular ways. Baltimore does not happen overnight. The types of issues that we see in Newark do not happen overnight. They're a response to a broader system of punishment and justice in our country that leads to these disparities. So how many of you have seen the documentary 13th by Ava DuVernay? I encourage all of you to do it. So one of the things that we know is that the US locks up more people per incident than any other country in the world. So we're only about 5% of the world's total population, but 25% of all inmates in our world are here in the United States. And what is key, so what I look at in my political science research, is that it's not about crime. So crime rates have gone down over time. It's about policy. So we are making conscious choices about which crimes we punish, about how we punish them, and how they lead to these broader disparities. African Americans make up about 11% of our country's population. Together, Blacks and Latinos are 60% of all Americans behind bars. We also spend a lot of money on our criminal justice system with very few outcomes. So about $200 billion per year, and every year 650,000 people leave prison. So they leave those prisons and return to communities that are often already struggling. So let me get to this. Anybody watch Orange is the New Black? Good, I'm not the only one, right? So we'll see what happens there. One of the other things that I think is really interesting in terms of how this anger breeds over time and how it creates a frustration, a shame, and a sense of stigma is that if we look at our policies, we often talk a lot about the overrepresentation of African American men in our criminal justice system, particularly those between the ages of 18 and 35. What is key is that Black women and Latinas now represent the fastest growing prison population in our country. So we're sending more women, more girls into prison, but we don't have the same level of resources and programs for them. Here's why it's important, not just in terms of the individual who's gotten in trouble. So again, this is not about making excuses for bad behavior. People should be held accountable for their actions. But it's also about realizing how our choices, our policy choices, have an impact on the broader community. So about 60% of women who are locked up in our country are the custodial parent for a minor child. So that means that we are locking up more mothers in our country, and what happens with those children who are left behind? It means that you now have grandparents raising grandkids that they had no idea they would have to raise. So we work with a group of grandparents to try to get them connected to talk about this. And a grandmother last week said, my grandson keeps saying lit, and I don't know what that means, and I'm just sick of hearing it. So it's like, me too. I'm tired of hearing that word too, but let us explain to you what this means. But it also means that as we have increased the number of women going into prison in this country, we've also increased the number of children going into foster care. So if any of you are social work majors or into that field, you know that children of color are less likely to be adopted out of that system than any other group. You also know that children in foster care are more likely to develop a learning disability, more likely to have anger management issues. So it's hard for Johnny to pay attention in class when he's catching hell at home, right? So again, that anger, that tension manifests in so many different ways. To this point where, this is sort of my favorite meme. I study sort of the memification of American politics. If it appears in a meme, then it must be true, right? So that most people look at this picture, and if I ask you, one of these is a convicted felon, which is it? How many of you would say Martha Stewart? How many of you would say Snoop? Snoop is not a convicted felon, but he has a new TV show coming out with Martha Stewart. It should be interesting, right? So how does all of this come together politically? In this current election space, which is unlike any we've ever seen before, right? And all of the claims about vote rigging and of saying that the system is rigged against particular people and of saying that it's a partisan approach. The part that no one is talking about, Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, all points in between, is that in this election that'll happen in 12 days, there are about 2.5 million people who will not be allowed to vote because they have a past felony conviction. So that means if you live in my home state of Virginia and you wrote a bad check when you were 19, I don't know how many people still write checks, but if you do, keep this in mind. If you write a bad check at the age of 19, you will permanently lose the ability to vote in the state of Virginia forever, right? And so that means that this sort of over-policing, the over-concentration of punishment in particular communities has a political consequence as well. Look at these key battleground states. Florida is the big state that everyone is talking about. Over 300,000 formerly incarcerated people will not be able to vote in that election. So being tough on crime seems to be the one thing that Democrats and Republicans can agree upon. And it then sort of fuels this sense of frustration with community members that no one is taking their issues seriously. So here's where we are. So we know these conditions, we know the criminal justice system that is structuring the meaning of citizenship in our country. So if you live in Kentucky and you've been convicted of a felony 30 years ago, and you now decide you've changed your life and you want to participate in the process, you have to first get a state legislator to introduce a bill on your behalf to have your voting rights reinstated. That then has to pass by a 2/3 majority vote in each chamber of the state legislature. Then the governor has to sign off on it, right? I know a lot of politicians. I don't know anyone that could help me go through that process. That's how the frustration gets concentrated in these communities. And so the question then becomes, what do they do? So when you feel that you have become a victim of civil death, or because of your actions, you have now been pushed out of the political space, what do you do? And so this is where we are, and I'm wrapping up here. Right? So when we look at how communities are organizing for social justice, and so I'm very intentional, it is not just about the movement for Black lives in this country. It is about a broader focus on social justice inequalities, of looking from state to state, not just at the national level. This is what has to happen. And that is what my co-author and I call building authentic power. And it's very simply this. Those who are closest to a problem, those who have been most directly affected by a policy, are best situated to lead efforts for that reform. And so what we look at is how those closest to these issues are actually doing this on a state-by-state basis and at the local level as well. So what do we see? What we're seeing is that these communities are organizing to move from pain to power. So that people often tell me this hashtag activism is great, right? You flooded our timelines with hands up, don't shoot. You've used every social media tool to get people to a rally. That's nice, but what does it mean, and will this be enduring? And the big one that I want to focus on for you are the electoral outcomes. The city of Ferguson has seen its largest voter turnout this year than it's ever seen in the last 30 years. What's the result of that? Increased voting registration and voter turnout amongst working class people in Ferguson, amongst communities of color. And this year they elected 2 people of color to the city council, right? So it's not just about complaining, it's about channeling that anger into action. The city of Chicago, so the prosecutor there failed to pursue charges against the officers who killed both Laquan McDonald and Tamir Rice. Remember, Tamir is the 12-year-old playing in the park. City of Chicago residents in those key wards said enough. If you don't represent us, regardless of your political party, then you don't deserve our support. And so Chicago voted out that prosecutor, an incumbent prosecutor, because they were outraged by those actions. The state of Florida will now lose this year a veteran prosecutor named Angela Corey. So Angela Corey is the one who argued in the case against George Zimmerman and lost that case, in the case of whether he killed Trayvon Martin. She also pursued charges against Marissa Alexander, the woman who had a domestic violence complaint and fired a shot into the air, and Angela Corey had pursued charges against her and a number of juvenile cases. So I say all of that to simply say this, right? Anger does not have to be a negative emotion. Anger can connect with the broader political context and the broader political space, as well as technology and social media to have these outcomes. So not only do you focus on the community, strengthening the community, empowering and bettering the community, but you can then use that base to attack policy reforms at the institutional level. Thank you.
That was Dr. Kalila Brown-Dean, and she was talking about from pain to power, building a new framework for social justice organization. Next, we're going to have Dr. Kevin Lanning. He's talking about social change, social media, and the rise of rage.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, committee. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I am so tempted to start ad-libbing now and to respond to Kalila's wonderful talk. I'll only mention one thing, my most recent confrontation with police in South Florida. I'm walking through my suburb, and a police officer goes by and slows down and comes to a stop. The window rolls down. The police officer says to me, "Excuse me, sir, we have a report of someone suspicious in the neighborhood. Have you seen him?" That's my experience with police because of the way I look. And we hear stories, and maybe they wash over us and we don't listen to stories of Black Lives Matter and the experience of mistrust. But those of us who have privilege and good fortune, and we all have good fortune to be here, this is a great university. This program that you're in, this symposium, is a wonderful testimony to the quality of the education you're getting here. But we tend to be blind to our own good fortune at times. So this photograph, like the other photographs you'll see in the presentation, were taken in West Palm Beach at a Donald Trump rally a couple weeks ago, excuse me. I took them. My friends described me as being undercover, but it was an uncomfortable time, I will say. So the question to begin, there's so much I could say right now about this election. My background is in psychology, but I teach political psychology to a group like many of you every election cycle. The elections bring us together. Elections are themselves multidisciplinary phenomena that touch upon our political selves, our sense of who we are, why voting matters, and so forth. When we look at this election is a different one. How do we think about Donald Trump? How do we think about what's been called as, sorry, wrong button here. Let's try again. Next. Okay. How might we describe this Trump ecosystem? And the Trump ecosystem includes Trump, it includes his supporters, it includes those who advocate on his behalf. And there's a metaphor, and I want to stress that this is a metaphor for thinking about Trump. The metaphor has an element of core truth in it, and that element is the, let's see, I'm still trying to find the button. This button? No. All right. It is thinking about bullying, the psychology of bullying. There's a great insight from the psychology of bullying, and that is that bullies do not stand alone, that bullies are part of a spectrum that ranges from the bully to the henchman. This is a wonderful term. This is the work of Dan Olweus, a Norwegian psychologist some years ago. From the bully to the henchman who actively encourages, to the passive supporter who likes what he sees but doesn't engage, to the passive defender, the possible defender who isn't comfortable with it, but for one reason or another does not get into it. And finally, at the far end, the defender, the true defender who will stand up and speak out and say that this is wrong. And we see something like that in the current GOP elites, that is political leadership, where we can draw a continuum from Donald Trump himself through his active supporters like Chris Christie, Rudy Giuliani, who you see here, to Pence, Rubio, Ryan, McCain, and Kasich, and finally to Republican leaders who have spoken out against Donald Trump. You see this not just in the elites, but also in the masses. In, for example, how we might describe a post on Facebook. The person who writes it, writes a hate post, all the way to the person who sees the hate post and unsubscribes. Okay, I'm going to try another button here. Let's try this one. No, let's try this one. Let's try this one. Okay. So my background's in psychology, and the question is, how do we describe why Trumpism? And there's all these different accounts that we might invoke, we might use. The first class of accounts are the ones that are the most compelling to me because it's what I do, moral and developmental psychology. Similarly, we might talk about motives and the structure of social networks, and I'm going to get into all those things. But the most basic, the most important in accounting for Trump are simple instrumental accounts. That Trump's behavior makes sense. It makes sense, it is rational. And we could talk about this with respect to every part of the spectrum, okay? Why is Trump Trump? Why are passive supporters, and so forth? In terms of Trump himself, his personality, the most important personality characteristic we see in writing on Donald Trump by people like Dan McAdams is that Trump is, anybody know the word? What word comes to mind? Audience, shout out. Narcissistic. Yes, that's the one which has been used more than any other to describe Donald Trump. Narcissistic. Another word that's been used to describe Trump is paranoid. Okay, echoing a strain of paranoia in American politics. There's a feature that's shared by narcissism and paranoia, a very important feature. The paranoid person says, "They're after me." And the most important word in that sentence, "they're after me," is me. That only I can fix this. Only I is the word of the paranoid. And it's also the expression of the narcissist. This only I stance is something which we see in a lack of empathy, okay? A failure to understand what's happening with somebody else. If we grab them, for example. There's another, and all those things, they kind of go together, and you say, yeah, you get it, that's self-evident. But there's this other characteristic which you see in some of Trump's speech, which seems a little bit different, and that is he's disgusted. He's easily disgusted. He talks about disgust over and over again. We saw him describe Megyn Kelly as blood dripping from this, blood dripping from her, whatever, with evident disgust. And the question is, where does disgust come from? And disgust is an emotion which is fundamentally about protecting the self. Don't contaminate me is disgust. And so with disgust, with the lack of empathy, with narcissism, with paranoia, all of these things have something in common. And that is the sentiment that only I matter. That Trump is fundamentally egocentric. Okay? Everything else stems from this, for me. Okay? And I see egocentrism not just as a personality characteristic, but as a starting point in moral development. Okay? We could talk about people being concerned just with themselves, with a broader sphere of community or country, America first, to a broader utilitarian stance where each life is equally valuable and the greatest good for the greatest number. And maybe even beyond that, we could talk about concerns such as human dignity that defy quantification. Okay? What I think is that, whoops, I did it again, that in understanding Trump's followers, that this notion of ego or moral development can be applied to them as well. That whereas Trump is focused just on himself, Trump's followers are focused on this notion of in-group loyalty and reciprocity and helping other people who are like us and not the people who are out there and who are different from us. Okay? That's how I see, how I can begin to see Trump and Trump's followers. When talking about Trump, the question of how has Trump gotten this far, Trump is all about change, and America likes change in its politics. 8 years ago, Barack Obama won the presidency based on the advocacy of hope and change. Okay. In 1992, what's his name? Third party little guy, Ross Perot. He was all about change. This notion of cleaning out the swamp. We like to do that in our politics, okay? Our politics is cyclical, okay? We embrace a political regime, and that regime, it's like it includes the seeds of its own destruction. We move from one thing to another. And Donald Trump seems to me, look, what we see in Trumpism, the rise of this alt-right, is something which is happening all over the world. But why is it that Donald Trump personifies this in this country? And for me, part of it is because Trump seems like the antithesis of Obama. He is the anti-Obama in almost every respect, except in that he's campaigning based on change, okay? If Obama's presidency has been characterized by civility and grace, Trump's candidacy has been a call to arms. If Obama's presidency has been an appeal to equality, to equal rights for people of all, for people of color, Trump's has been about take our country back. And I'll come back to this in a minute. Okay? And the point is that in understanding Trump, we've got to think about the situation. Why does Trump claim that the election is rigged? We could point to a few different things. First of all, his personality. I mentioned narcissism. Those of you who are in psychology know that narcissism, it's not just about me, but there's something fragile and vulnerable about narcissism, okay? Narcissism is a vulnerable characteristic. Losing is threatening. And if the election is rigged, Trump doesn't really lose. It's not about him. It's not as injuring. Concerns about fraud are not just Trump's story. That is a story which is linked with the GOP and the right. On the left, we're concerned, as Kalila mentioned, we're concerned about disenfranchisement, about people who have the right to vote not getting the vote. That's on the left. On the right, and this is your right, yes? Okay. So on the right, we've got just the opposite pattern. The concern is not with people who do have the right to vote who don't get it, but the opposite. People who don't have the right to vote getting the right to vote. There's a trade-off between fraud and disenfranchisement, and that trade-off is echoed in the spectrum from left to right. Okay? And the third reason is that I mentioned in passing this instrumental idea, the appeal to rigged, it resonates. It resonates with Trump's audience. It resonates with at least some. The notion that things aren't fair. And the question is, to whom does that particularly speak? How do we understand the psychology of Trump's followers? And the most important factor, again, is it's a brute force one. It is a lazy one. It is inertia. It is partisanship. It is a belief that I've always voted for the GOP, and so I'm going to do it again. This is the bulk of Trump's support. We could talk about other ideas, the notion that celebrity carries with it a certain authority. But there's also the idea that America, empirically, America has withstood a great deal. America withstood Andrew Jackson. You know, we can withstand a great deal. America can withstand Trump, and we need change, and therefore that this is my man. The idea behind this instrumental thing, and the idea that we must remember, is that you could be for Trump without being full of hate. There's Hillary Clinton's famous quote about the basket of deplorables. If you listen to the whole thing, she's saying half of America, or half of Trump supporters are deplorables. And she's trying to reach out clumsily to the other half. Okay? And we'll come back to the word deplorable in a minute. I think the word deplorable is deplorable. I'll echo that, okay? But there is this other half. This is the other half. This is Mike, who is standing behind me at the Trump rally. Mike, who left early after waiting for Trump because he had to go back to work. True. And the question, with whom does this resonate? It resonates with people like Mike. Mike, standing there, Mike is losing something with this election. Mike is threatened by this election. What Mike sees in America is an America that's changing, okay? It's changing. America's face is your face collectively. We are moving to a majority-minority country. We're becoming like something that we weren't before. We are a country where a black man can become president, and perhaps a woman can become president too. And that's different from the way it was when Mike grew up and I grew up, when people like me had the rights to this first. And so if America's changing, and I'm an American, and that notion, I'm an American, that is something which is core. This is why disenfranchisement is a big deal, ex-felon disenfranchisement. Because when you tell them they can no longer vote, you are telling them they are not an American. You are taking away their sense of self, okay? And you're taking a chunk out of them. It matters to you, it matters to them, it matters to Mike. And what Mike knows is that if I'm an American and America's changing, then he asks, who am I? Okay, there is something which is really threatening about these changes. And there's another side to it too, and that's the notion of privilege. Okay, that's that thing when I go down the street and the police officer rolls down the window, suspicious. Yeah, I'm Martha Stewart in drag or whatever you call it. No, I'm not. Okay, but really, you know, how dare you call me unsuspicious? The idea is that this notion of privilege, which washes over us so easily and we're blind to, is something that can't be extended to all. That if everyone has privilege, privilege no longer exists. And Mike believes that he's earned it through his hard work. And we're in an economically challenging time. We're in a time of globalization when people across the borders are threatening your jobs, when robots are threatening your jobs and so forth, all that stuff. Okay? But this notion, I've earned this, and they're taking it away. That's Mike. But it's not just about Trump. There's this other side. How am I on time? This is, okay, that's like, how I've done, what, 15 minutes so far? Great, okay. So there's another side to it. Everything I've been talking about so far is Trump and Trumpism, and I'm even doing it with the hands now, okay? And what's going on the right. But when we look at what's going on in America, there's something broader, and that's this phenomenon of polarization. And part of it is Kalila's talk. There's this really interesting thing with social progress, and that is, I think that social progress cascades. I think it cascaded in the 60s, cascades, okay, it gets bigger and bigger. Snowball rolling down a hill, okay? That when we see social change, when we see other people speak out against differential treatment, against the phenomenon of being abused or grabbed, and that raises our consciousness, and we say, that happened to me too. And this happened in the 60s with the left. The push for equality accelerates, and it's happening now. And there's a sense in which it's a wonderful thing for those of us who hold deeply the value of equality. But the deep value of equality, while all of us share it to some degree, others think that things like freedom and liberty are more important, if not as important, as equality. And so rising equality is separating America, the left, from the right. When we understand this, the question, should we deplore Trump and his followers? And if you look at this face, the anger in this, is this an angry face? I'm sorry, this sounds like what we'd say to a little kid. This is a really sad face. And the response to loss, and the loss of privilege, and the loss of identity, is at times sadness as well. We've moved in talking about those who argue for inequality or language about inequality. We've talked about this in the past as politically incorrect. And there's a shift where we could say now it's deplorable. And we've given up this pretense of objectivity. I teach political psychology. And in my class this term, I teach it every election cycle. And at the beginning of class, I typically say that there's this interesting question. How do we, as professors, talk about our own political beliefs? And political scientists would say, you'd never impose your political beliefs on a class, because to do so is to stifle discourse. There's this power asymmetry and so forth. And some psychologists would say, no, that's true, but your bias is there anyway. And it's even more insidious if you don't acknowledge it as a professor in a class. And in 2016, in teaching this class this term, for the first time, I said, today there's a third position, and we have to at least address it. And that is, not to speak out in the time of Trump is not merely a question of psych versus poli-sci. It is a question of intellectual courage. If we're in a time of the rise of authoritarianism, as we were in the 1930s, then failing to speak out about it is wrong. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the Supreme Court says she can't imagine what America would be like if Trump became president. And to my students, I tell them that there's this stance that Trump is an authoritarian, and that maybe it's time for me too to speak out. And when I do that, and when Ruth Bader Ginsburg does that, this rope that links the left and right, we have ripped it in the middle. There's no longer any connection between us. That continuum of bullying, there's no longer any way to get, to cross, to bridge this gap. Polarization happens for a number of reasons. There's the psychology of polarization. We seek confirmation. I don't know if you have a chance to take a course in behavioral economics, thinking and decision making. Social psych, we talk about it. Confirmation biases. We seek information that goes along with our beliefs. We tend not to falsify hypotheses. Okay? We look for stuff that's easy. We look for that in our friends. We look for people who agree with us. To disagree is to be disagreeable. Okay? We have a preference for like-minded others. And you see this in your Facebook communities. See this on Facebook. I'm going to defriend anybody who says stuff that I disagree with between now and the election. How many of you have seen that? Yeah. There's this phenomenon in group reasoning. When individuals move into groups and those groups talk to each other, the groups become more extreme in a phenomenon that psychologists call group polarization. That's what happens in groups. There is the tendency further to misperceive the opponent as even more extreme than they are. And so in social networks, we see patterns like this. These are lines. Each node, each dot in this map is a blog. Each link is a link to a blog. The blue blogs are liberal blogs. The red blogs are conservative blogs. All of this is kind of self-evident, except for the fact that this was done in 2004. And the pattern now is much more extreme. This is what we see in virtual communities. There's something similar going on in physical communities, with people migrating to live near like-minded others. There's a geography of polarization, a psychology of polarization, okay? And there is, and we see different worlds, okay? Many of you did not know that Trump is now leading in Virginia, Florida, Iowa, Ohio, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania, as was reported on the Conservative Army website on October 21st. This stream, I have, just as I went to the Trump rally, I have an alt Facebook page where I have friended all these Trump groups. This is what they see on a day-to-day basis. This is their virtual world where they're spending hours and hours watching, reading, learning about the rise of the right and what's going to happen next. For example, we see that political scientists have shown, okay, that the well-known Helmut Norpoth has predicted a Trump election win. And when we see this, when we see all this stuff, what do we think? We think Trump's going to win, because that's everything we know. We've been told Trump is going to win. And if we're told Trump is going to win and Trump doesn't win, then we believe that something's wrong here, that the election was rigged. And of course, those on the left see this and they say, how silly, how foolish of those on the right who we can describe as being lower in ego development, all these things, and we can act in a patronizing way towards them. And we forget that in 1972, which incidentally was my very first political campaign, going door to door for George McGovern in California after Nixon had been called to win the election. The movie critic Pauline Kael, famous quote, "Nixon couldn't have won. Nobody I knew voted for him." We were already in these enclaves in 1972, and we're there even more now. So you've got this perfect storm where it is rational, arguably, to believe what you hear, that Trump is going to win. And that if Trump doesn't win, it can only happen because of fraud. Okay. I've got some empirical data here looking at differences between the content of Trump and Clinton pages, okay, on Facebook, these official pages. And I'm going to just characterize these real briefly, mostly because those of you who do work in the sciences and do experimentation, there's this new recognition that we should acknowledge null results, that these are as important as strong results. And the results here are really pretty modest, but there are a couple of surprises, okay? So we've got basically 1,300 official posts from Trump and Clinton, and then well over 1 million comments, responses to those posts. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare the contents of the posts, Trump and Clinton, okay, and the comments, Trump and Clinton. And when you do that, you see this interesting effect where anger has this positive result, echoing Kalila's work, this kind of bizarre result. There's a sense in which we're all Pauline Kael. We all hear only the people who are like us. On your left, okay, you see what's happening in the posts, the small number of posts. And on the whole, these are pretty different. The stuff that in Hillary's posts, there's a lot of stuff about women and so forth. I've analyzed this data in a couple of different ways. This is just the most colorful. The red, you see language. Trump's language is actually quite positive. He's a very good salesperson about what we will do and so forth. But the most striking result here is that you see in the comments on Clinton pages, you see all of this anger, all of this bloviating. And what's happening is that the trolls on social media are looking at Clinton pages. And so they're in the same room as Clinton. And they're using much the same language, even if we see terms such as Benghazi, video, foundation, lying, lied, lie, etc. The key point is that they're quite, overall, they're similar. And you do see this trolling, that they're in the same room. Okay, additional analyses of this I'm not going to go into for this, but what I will say is there's a second way of analyzing these data, and it's more interesting, and that is what parts of speech go along with the posts that are most shared, okay? And so for each post, we're going to look and we're going to score it for linguistic categories, and we're going to rate those we're going to relate those to the number of shares. And especially interesting, the key hypothesis here would be that angry posts go viral. They are contagious, okay? They are likely to be shared. And the effect of that is really minor, if at all. So we're left with a couple of ideas. There are two problems facing us now with respect to anger in America. And one is the language of the rise of the alt-right. Sorry, I'm skipping over to my second point. I'll come back to the first one in a second. The rise of the alt-right versus the loss of the center. What should we be more concerned with? Should people like me and Ruth Bader Ginsburg and most major media outlets in this country, should we cede the center at this time and speak out against it? Or in doing so, are we contributing to making the country worse rather than better? That's the second point. The first point at the top, Trump's call, it's rigged. What does that do when you hear that? If you were a Trump supporter, a passive Trump supporter like the guy there I pointed to and said was sad, you stay home. You're not energized to go and brave the cold New Jersey weather that you have here, okay? And to stand in line for hours. Why bother? And so this language of it's rigged, it may actually lead to even fewer people voting for Trump, and even a less plausible argument that the campaign is rigged. And so maybe on November 9th we'll wake up and this claim that it's rigged, it will go past us, okay? The most optimism we have is the greatest call for optimism we have when we look at this rise of the alt-right, not just in America and the world, is to think that maybe what's happening here is actually a great moment for America. To those of us who decry Trumpism, maybe America will be the first to repudiate the rise of this ethnic nationalism. Okay, thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank both of you for very, very interesting discussions, and this topic is very topical. I'd like to take a few questions. We have a few minutes for questions. I'd like to try to start with students, if we could, first. Don't be shy. Yes, go ahead. And we have a question right up here or back there. Go ahead.
What did I say to the police officer? What I said, I think I was a little taken aback, even, but it took me a minute to get it. It took me a second to be troubled by this. Okay, there was a similar phenomenon just after September 11, 2001, where I went to a ball game and had this big jacket with all my peanuts and stuff in it, so I didn't have to pay for them at the ball game. I couldn't find my cell phone in my pockets, and they were scanning everybody, and the guy just waved me along, and I was just like, really? I think that if you look like me or you, that we've got an obligation when we're treated differently to say, treat me, we're being profiled, and we're being profiled in a way that injures all of us. But it's hard to recognize that when it happens, I think.
I think there was a question, gentleman back there. You don't have to stand if it's...
Hi, my name is Zach Thomas. I am a junior here. I'm also the Board of Trustees representative, so that's pretty cool, right? But my question really is, and again, thank you for coming out today, but I personally, through my relationships, have been affected by what is effectively an epidemic of opiate abuse and heroin addiction in New Jersey. And through this, I've been exposed to a sort of growing dichotomy between police and civilians. And so it seems almost as if at the cost of public health and personal liberty that we're favoring security, that we have to sacrifice something for security. And so my question is, a lot like that post 9/11 paranoia, that fear, do you feel that this seemingly growing dichotomy between police and civilian is going to lead to a loss of civil liberty or losing of some sort of right?
So I think it's an excellent point in terms of where we are beyond these kinds of issues. And two things come to mind. So I hear a lot of people who say to me, look, we've had a problem with opiate abuse and addiction for years. Why is it that we're now talking about it? But also how we talk about it. So that if it is a college co-ed who develops an addiction and overdoses, the way that's discussed is, look at this beautiful young woman who happened to engage in this risky behavior or got involved with the wrong crowd. Let's think about that. As opposed to the way that we talked about, say, the crack epidemic in the 1990s, where addiction became a moral indictment. But I think also, to Kevin's point, this is where collectively people need to start addressing this. What is the trade-off that we're willing to make? People have the right to feel safe and secure in their person, in their home, and in their community. So how do you balance that with how we become safer? And that is partially about what the demand is of law enforcement across the board and what the demands are of us as citizens. So that, in Connecticut, we had a big discussion about Narcan and whether law enforcement should carry that. And a group of legislators said, if you allow them to carry Narcan, which will stop the overdose, you're going to encourage addicts to simply get high because they know that you'll save their lives. Whereas addicts will tell you that is the worst thing because now you're stopping my high, and that's the whole point of me doing it. So that discourse becomes reality for people who don't have direct connection. And that's whether we're talking about people in urban communities saying, when I see police officers, I don't feel safe, I feel threatened, or I feel afraid. It is also the same sort of negotiation of people saying, when I am in hijab, I feel like I am treated differently because I can't mask my faith, or because other people have perceptions of that. So there are ways that particularly young people can take their experiences and connect it to these broader challenges.
Probably have time for just one more question.
Hello, my name is Esmat, and I'm responding to you. You're saying that the anger is not working. My age is very high. 50 years ago, maybe it was during the Vietnam time, people came out. They showed their anger. And finally, they got to a result. Now, after 50 years, I see situation is worse. And the only reason I'm not black, but I have accent. I feel it every day that it's not the same country. So what do you advise to young people? And there is no community that they could advise them, push them to a right way. So what is your advice?
So I'm not saying that anger isn't working. I'm actually saying that anger is working because it is pushing us to consider things that previously we didn't have to acknowledge and address. So again, it's not about excusing bad behavior. But until we saw the uprisings in Ferguson and in Baltimore, the Department of Justice was silent about decades of abuses of power. So that if you read the report out of Baltimore, it very clearly shows this didn't start with this mayor, it did not start with this police chief. It was about the choice we were making about where people lived in Baltimore and did it threaten my property value if I had an apartment near the Inner Harbor where all the tourists go. So anger does work in that way. The second point is that Coretta Scott King has this quote, freedom is never really won, you earn it and win it with every generation. So that means that these battles continue. So the battle that people were facing in the 60s because they felt like African Americans were moving into their neighborhoods and lowering their property value is now what we see in, my home state of Virginia and North Carolina, where people who were previously migrant workers are now staying in the area. And in New Jersey, where people are saying, our public schools are so diverse, so much money is going toward these English as a second language programs that my kid can't take an AP class because the community is changing and now the demands are different. The very quick thing that I will say, young people have access to technology, but also to revolution in a way that we could never have predicted. So if we could get 500,000 people to the March on Washington in DC without Eventbrite or without Yik Yak, there is no excuse for young people today to not be able to do that. So it's fine if you go on TMZ or you like World Star Hip Hop, that's fine, I don't condemn that. But add something into that. To go to the Black Youth Project, go to colorlines.org. Connect with young people around not just the country, but around the world who are concerned about these same issues so that you're not reinventing the wheel, but seeing that there's strength in numbers.
Okay, we're going to have to end it there. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for the wonderful speakers we had.